Good morning. The bulletin cover this morning is a little bit of a tease. Peace polls are coming to Union Kong. Peace polls are coming to the front of our property soon. They won't be those polls exactly. That isn't our garden, if you couldn't tell. It's just a tease. Peace polls are coming. And the reason that we put those on the front cover is because I had a great deal of difficulty selecting a picture that would fit nicely with the scripture reading for today. What is Paul talking about? I confess that when I was in your shoes, meaning when I was sat in the pews, listening to the Bible lesson for the day, if someone was reading from one of Paul's letters, I was always really attentive for the first verse or maybe two, and then I would begin to lose the thread quite quickly. I would hear snippets, yet whatever gain, righteousness from God, something based on faith, sharing of his sufferings, the prize of the heavenly call, and try to piece that all together. For me, at least, it's always been an enormous challenge to try to get to the bottom of one of Paul's threads. So I'll focus on one word because that's how I need to understand this particular piece of scripture. I'll focus on one word in particular because it's such a great word that we don't use enough in our society, which is rubbish. It can be a noun, a verb, an adjective in England, I assume in other parts of the English-speaking world. We don't use that word enough in America. Rubbish. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things, and I regard them as rubbish. What's rubbish? All things. What do you mean all things? What things? Do you really mean the loss of all things? Before that, he talks about his status as a person of privilege within Judaism. He says a Hebrew born of Hebrews. Yes. Blameless, confident, righteous. Okay. Paul, not short on self-belief. And yet this status that he both inherited and worked hard to maintain was now, what he is saying, rubbish. Nothing in his eyes. Happy to lose it, lose his status, bury it as something unimportant. He also doesn't mention here particularly, but it's important to know that Paul is a Roman citizen and receives the benefits of that status too, as a person of privilege. The world is at his feet. Everything anybody could really want, Paul has. And like so many before and since, he realizes the things that have helped puff him up, helped him to stick his chest out, be a little bit arrogant about are really not that important. More than that, though, he looks at his culture and the culture that is around him, and he's dismayed by the norms that he sees in his society. What norms are those? Aelius Aristides, in his oration to the Romans in the mid-2nd century, says to an audience who are celebrating the birth of Rome, with the emperor present, he says to the people gathered, You have appointed everywhere to your citizenship or even to kinship with you the better part of the world's talent, courage, and leadership, while the rest you recognize as a league under your hegemony. All localities are full of gymnasia, fountains, monumental approaches, temples, workshops, and schools. And one can say that the civilized world, which had been sick from the beginning, as it were, has been brought by the right knowledge to a state of health. Thus it is right to pity those outside of your hegemony, if indeed there are any, because they lose such blessings. And Paul has traveled around the empire 100 years or so before these words are offered, and he would know that what Aelius Aristides said in his oration to the Romans is rubbish. Pure and utter nonsense. Those in the Roman Empire who were citizens were indeed privileged, but most were not. For long periods of the 1st century, poll taxes were placed on laborers and farmers. Citizens never had to pay those taxes. People were robbed by tax collectors who took more than they needed to line their own pockets. There was a gradual movement away from the fields and towards the cities, precisely because the living was so hard, and the empire continued to tax your goods in more and more ways, both in kind and monetary taxes. And for a long time, if you had a drought, too bad, so sad. Soldiers who went to war would return home to their land and often sell rather than start over. So as people deserted or sold their land, the fields were possessed by fewer and fewer people who grew their holdings. People fled into the wilderness. People who had worked the fields, they fled into the wilderness, figuring it would be easier to live out in a desert or high in a forest and subsist that way rather than continue to farm. Taxes would typically take at least 3 months of a laborer's wages. And you couldn't move up. There was almost no social mobility. Even the inheritance laws worked against you. A non-citizen could not inherit from a citizen. And if you were a citizen who married a non-citizen, guess what happens to your children? They automatically receive the lower status of the two people in the couple. Not only were you trapped by your social circumstances, it would be impossible to dream of a different kind of life for your children. Meanwhile, you can imagine we here in the 21st century, we see signs for Eat Clean Bro and Netflix and CBS All Access and tons of other companies. In Paul's day, one company. Every bridge, aqueduct, monument, coin, cup, statue, altar, temple, port, and road across the empire would sing the praises of the empire, often proclaiming the divinity of the emperor. Yes, the divine nature of the emperor is responsible for all of this, as Aelius Aristides says, responsible for bringing everything to a state of health. Paul looks out of all of this and seems to wonder, if he has status, but he has status in this system, what does that mean? In 2009, I just mentioned Netflix. In 2009, they put forth an internal document that was made public entitled Reference Guide on Our Freedom and Responsibility Culture that detailed the norms that the company's leaders hoped would permeate the company. While there is a lot of emphasis on personal freedom and responsibility, and some of those things are refreshingly empowering, there's no vacation policy, take what you need. It is equally alarming in the way in which humans are commoditized. The guide suggests that all managers should use a keeper test, which is defined as, which of my people, if I am a supervisor, if they told me that they were leaving in 2 months for a similar job at a peer company, would I fight hard to keep at our company? The answer to that question is straightforward. Once you have identified the right person, the right star, everyone else should be given a severance package in order to make way for the next star. And that term star is used a lot in that document. And of course, the term star is likely to induce concern in the most reasonable and self-reflective individuals, right? Because reasonable self-reflective individuals are likely to ask themselves if they deserve that term themselves. And worse yet, star is so vague that it suggests to any person who is struggling for any particular reason that their struggles would not be met with compassion and concern, but with a severance package and a cardboard box. Netflix, of course, is a Wall Street darling. The company has made lots of money for its investors while being a brilliant symbol of our modern era as a service that enables us, you and me, to be endlessly entertained without ever leaving our living rooms. I love Netflix. Our society, of course, is one of immediate gratification and all kinds of freedom. Many, although certainly not all, Americans have access to easy credit, devices that make our lives way less labor-intensive, and like I said, we have entertainment at our fingertips constantly. We know this. Stand at any subway stop or hover for a few minutes in an airport terminal. We see lots of people amazingly, astonishingly connected to social networks all over the world, paying absolutely no attention to the person next to them. And because we live in a highly individualized and materialistic society, Thomas Sedlacek says, we often fail to notice that the fulfillment of our desires is not happiness or satisfaction. It's just it's a multiplication of our desires. The more we have, the more we want. And while we have collectively attained these devices that make our lives less labor-intensive, we have simultaneously become that much more depressed. Today, more people die by suicide than all the wars, terrorist attacks, murders, and government executions combined. The World Health Organization reports that the rates of self-harm have increased in the last generation in almost every corner of the globe. But in the United States, between 2008 and 2015, the number of children and adolescents receiving hospital treatment after suicide ideation or self-harm doubled. According to the CDC director, Robert Redfield, a couple of years ago, the latest CDC data show that the U.S. life expectancy is now declining. This troubling trend, this is a quote, this troubling trend is largely driven by drug overdoses and suicide. Life expectancy gives us a snapshot of the nation's overall health, and these statistics are a wake-up call that we are losing too many Americans too early and too often to preventable conditions. One can infer that as we are socialized to become highly individualized and have placed a high degree of emphasis on materialism, then if the fulfillment of desires is a multiplication of desire, modern Americans will find it incredibly easy to fall into a desperate state of anxiety. For many Americans, our work lives only further exacerbate the pressures that can overwhelm us, as the Netflix example might demonstrate. And so in our season of Lent, what does this mean? And where on earth is the good news? Because it's not as if I want to simply rewind and go back 2,000 years or to hang out with Paul the Apostle and pretend that that was a more idyllic time. As I said, I really like having Netflix. And that more idyllic time, it never really existed anyway. A story that you'll hear again later this year for sure as we head towards the next program year. Josie, my daughter, and I were in the car, on the parkway actually, and she said to me, let's play a game. Better then or now? I said, what is then? 100 years ago? Is that what you mean by then? She said, sure. Okay. Transportation. Was it better then or now? I said, well, we can go a lot faster now, and I like that. And despite all the hassles of driving, plus we have way cooler bicycles, I'll go with now. Okay, healthcare. Better then or now? I said, I'll take my chances with now. Education. Schools. I said, wow, that's interesting, but I'll go with now. Okay, is there anything that was better then? She asked me. I said, well, I think we made a trade-off, right? We gained a lot of things, and we lost some things. And we know we lost what it was to be neighbors to other people. The whole idea of a neighborhood, neighboring, neighborliness. And she said, what's that? And I said, yeah. Peace be with you.